This is Chris Sartorial. This is the first of a short series of videos in which I'll be addressing common pattern making and fitting mistakes, ones made not only by beginners and hobbyists, but also by professional pattern makers and technical designers. In this first video, we'll be addressing neck and shoulder balance.
One of the most egregious or troublesome errors in pattern making that I very often see today involves making patterns in what I call a cookie cutter style. Now, you may have seen examples where a pattern maker will demonstrate drafting a bodice or blouse where he or she will draw the back bodice and then one shallow line for the back neckline and a deeper curve for the front neckline, and a shallower curve for the back armhole and a deeper curve for the front. And then we'll cut this out for the back and cut out the inner lines for the front neck and armhole, and you have your front and your back. And the only real difference between them is the neck and armhole curve. It's very fast, it's very easy, and it's also very wrong. There is a whole lot of differences between the human body's front and back that are not being taken into account here, and this is not going to fit well. One of the worst errors involves the neck and shoulder. I'm going to take if I take my previously drafted front bodice and I line up the shoulder front and back, you'll see that I have a gap here between the center back and the center front. It's about 1/4 of an inch, about 6 millimeters wide. That's because the human body is narrower across the front shoulder than it is across the back shoulder.
Our shoulders angle forward.
If you measure any body from the same 2 points across the back shoulder, you'll get a wider measurement than you will from the same 2 points across the front, totaling about 1/2 inch all the way across, or about 1.5 centimeters. So you always need to take that into account when drafting. As you can see, if I line up my center front and center back, I have a gap here at the outer of about that same amount. There are many other things that you need to take into account, especially at the armhole, etc., which we won't get into right now. But the main focus now I'm talking about is with the neck and shoulder. Here I've taken my previously drafted fitted bodice and I've made the front and cut it the same width across the neck and shoulders as the back. And in this case I've pinned it here at the center back to hold the back neck in place. And you'll see what's happening now in the front. I'm getting quite a big gap in the front of this neck. It's too wide across the front now, and it's manifesting itself in this big gap across the front neck. If I'd done the opposite, if I'd taken the correct front and then drafted the back neck width the same as the front, you'd have the opposite. It would be fitting well in the front, and you'd have pulling across the back because it would then be too narrow across the back, and you'd have drag lines probably. But I'm going to now remove this pin, and I'm going to let this fall where it wants to. And you can see immediately that the whole neck wants to ride to the back. And the shoulder seams are now shifted to the back and the front neck has moved up. That's because the whole garment does not want to sit properly on the shoulders. I've been in fittings where design teams are fitting garments like this. And an inexperienced technical designer might look at a pattern like this on a dress form or on a fit model and try to correct these problems piecemeal. In other words, might say, oh, we need to look at this and say, we need to raise this back neck up. and fill this in here, and we need to shift the shoulder seam forward, and we need to cut the neck deeper in front. All of those things in this case are the absolute wrong things to do. Doing so would completely shift the high point shoulder up out of place. The bodice would be too long in the back and too short and hiking up in the front. In other words, you'd be doing a whole lot of damage because the problem was misdiagnosed. And you can see if I simply pinch this up a little bit in the front to make the front neck the front a little narrower, the neckline falls into place, the shoulder seam is where it should be, you don't have the excess room across the front. So if you see any of these problems in a fitting, gapping or too wide across the front neck, too narrow or pulling across the back, a neck that wants to ride to the back, or shoulder seams that are riding or angling to the back, the very first thing you want to check out is to compare the front neck shoulder width to the back neck shoulder width and verify that the front is slightly narrower than the back by about a ½ inch all the way across, or about 1.5 centimeters. Once you have verified that, then you can address the other problems. Here is the bodice we were just looking at, laying on the table. If you don't have access to the pattern, one way you might be able to tell whether the garment is correct is to lay it flat on the table, and I've had to work a little bit to spread it. But if the neck and shoulders will lay absolutely flat like this, with the seams flat and the neck flat, now right away, of course, you can tell that there's very little difference between the front and back width across the chest, and it should be a bigger difference than that, at least in a fitted garment. But also, if this were made correctly with the front slightly narrower than the back, the shoulder seams would want to roll forward, which they will do so naturally if the pattern is made correctly. It should not sit absolutely flat like this.